Void pressed in, an indifferent blanket of charcoal and scattered diamond dust. Dean, hunched over a flickering console, felt its familiar weight. 3 years of solitude had etched lines around his eyes, not from worry, but from the ceaseless, undifferentiated expanse. His vessel, the stray dog, was a skeletal thing, more rust than hull, but it was his, and it kept him alive. His days were a monotonous rhythm: drift, scan, salvage, repeat. The reward was negligible, the company non-existent. He'd chosen this existence, a deliberate withdrawal after a failure that still scraped at the edges of his sleep. Today's scan had been like any other, a broad sweep across a forgotten quadrant far from established lanes. The initial blips were typical: asteroid clusters, spent propulsion units, the husks of long-dead satellites. Then a signature appeared, anomalous. It wasn't just faint, it was wrong. The object registered as solid mass, yet its energy profile was a chaotic smear. Dean leaned closer, his breath fogging the ancient display. No known designation, no transponder signal, just a persistent, irregular distortion. Curiosity, a spark he thought long extinguished, flickered. He altered course, the stray dog groaning in protest as its thrusters engaged with a familiar, asthmatic cough. Hours passed, marked only by the slow crawl of the anomaly's signature towards the center of his screen. As he drew closer, the visual feed resolved the object. It was a vessel, undeniably, but its form defied immediate understanding. It was not sleek, nor utilitarian, nor brutalist. It simply was. Its surfaces seemed to shift in the ambient light, not reflecting, but absorbing, then releasing the starlight in impossible angles. Edges appeared where no edge should be, planes twisted into themselves, and the overall shape refused to resolve into a coherent whole. It was like trying to hold water in a net, or perceive a color that didn't exist. Dean felt a dull pressure behind his eyes, a phantom ache of misperception. He ran a diagnostic, the readings confirming his visual confusion. The vessel's dimensions were inconsistent, its mass fluctuating. He cycled the airlock, the familiar hiss a comfort against the silent impossibility before him. His heavy boots clanked against the stray dog's deck plating as he made his way to the shuttle bay. He armed his cutting torch and magnetic grapples, standard Salvager's kit. The closer he got, the more pronounced the visual dissonance became. The vessel seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of space around it was disturbed. He pushed past the unease. This was a find, a big one. Something this strange would fetch a price, even if only for academic curiosity. After a tense, careful approach, he docked his shuttle, the magnetic clamps struggling to find purchase on the vessel's strange, non-uniform hull. The airlock cycled open with an unnerving, almost organic sigh. Inside, the atmosphere was thin, cool, and utterly still. No sounds, no telltale hum of dormant systems, just a profound, unsettling quiet. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors that bent at impossible angles, leading to chambers that felt both vast and claustrophobic simultaneously. His flashlight beam seemed to lose definition, its edges blurring against the strangely textured walls. He moved cautiously, his boots echoing in the oppressive silence. He scanned for life signs, for traps, for anything. Nothing. The vessel was a tomb. After what felt like an eternity, he entered a central chamber. It was circular, yet the walls seemed to curve away and towards him at the same time. In the exact center, perched on a pedestal of the same shifting, indeterminate material as the walls, rested the artifact. It was small, no larger than his fist, and appeared to be a complex arrangement of interlocking facets. But like the vessel itself, its geometry was profoundly wrong. It wasn't merely irregular, it was impossible. As he approached, the facets seemed to turn, but without any discernible mechanism. His vision swam. A momentary flicker, a sensation of falling upwards, then a sudden jarring shift in the room's perspective. The circular chamber seemed to flatten, then stretch, then fold in on itself, all in the span of a breath. Dean staggered, gripping the cutting torch for balance, his knuckles white. He shook his head, clearing the strange distortion. He blamed the low-level radiation, the stale air, the sheer isolation. He was tired. He extended a gloved hand, hesitation warring with his ingrained salvager's drive. This was unique, this was valuable. His fingers brushed the artifact's surface. It was cool, smooth, and utterly seamless. The moment contact was made, a jolt, not electrical but perceptual, shot through him. The air around him shimmered. The distant pinprick stars visible through a viewport suddenly seemed to move, not across the blackness, but within it, like motes of dust caught in a current. His ears rang with a high, sustained tone that wasn't there a second ago. He snatched his hand back, gasping, but the ringing persisted. He knew he shouldn't linger. He knew he should leave this impossible place, but the artifact, even with its subtle, disorienting power, called to him. It was a mystery, a profound anomaly in a universe he thought he understood. He pulled a specialized containment field from his pack, a standard issue for volatile materials, and carefully, deliberately enclosed the artifact. Its strange light pulsed, even through the field. He secured the field, then turned, retracing his steps through the impossibly angled corridors. He set a course for his solitary base of operations, a derelict structure he'd repurposed, affectionately if ironically dubbed his research station. It was a place where he could catalog his finds, repair his vessel, and most importantly, be utterly alone. As the stray dog lumbered away from the impossible vessel, Dean felt the hum behind his eyes intensify. He looked down at the contained artifact, its facets still seeming to shift within the field. The universe, vast and indifferent, had just shown him a sliver of something he had no framework to understand, and he had invited it in. His vessel, the stray dog, now tethered itself to the derelict hulk, a skeletal hand clasping a forgotten wrist. He moved with the practiced economy of a scavenger, each motion calculated to conserve air and energy. The air in the derelict's interior was stale, tasting of ozone and metallic decay. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors, his boots echoing in the oppressive silence, until he reached the compartment he had identified earlier, a section designated as a research station. The artifact rested on a tilted console, its form absorbing the dim utility lights rather than reflecting them. It was a structure of impossible angles, a non-Euclidean geometry that seemed to shift and reconfigure itself in the periphery of his vision. Its surface was neither smooth nor rough, but possessed a quality that defied tactile description, like touching a concept rather than an object. Retrieving it required careful maneuvering. Dean activated his cargo drone, a squat, multi-limbed machine designed for delicate extractions. He guided its manipulators, securing the artifact within a reinforced containment field. The drone's sensors registered no discernible mass, no energy signature, yet it existed, solid and undeniably present. He felt a strange resistance as the drone lifted it, not physical, but a subtle drag on his own perception, as if the space around the object resented its displacement. Back aboard the stray dog, the air purifier hummed a monotonous tune. Dean secured the containment field in a dedicated locker within his cramped living quarters. The locker was designed for hazardous materials, lined with lead and insulated against all known forms of radiation. The artifact, however, registered nothing. It simply was. He sealed the hatch with a firm click, the sound sharp in the quiet. The object was now his. He sat at his console, reviewing the data logs from the derelict, a routine attempt to justify the risk. The logs were corrupted, fragmented, filled with static and nonsensical pictograms. He rubbed at his temples. The long hours, the sudden rush of discovery, they were taking their toll. A faint, dry rustle brushed the edge of his hearing. Dean paused, head cocked. The stray dog was silent, save for the hum of life support. He dismissed it. Fatigue, isolation. He tried to focus on the distorted images on his screen. The derelict schematics flickered, then for a fraction of a second. The steel bulkheads of his own ship seemed to ripple, the rigid lines of the corridor outside his viewport blurring into something less solid, less defined. The aberration vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving the familiar metallic sheen of his vessel intact. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. His vision was fine. No, his vision was always fine. He scanned the internal sensors. No atmospheric distortion, no power fluctuations, just a trick of the light, perhaps. A prickle crawled up the back of his neck. An irrational certainty that another consciousness occupied the empty space directly behind him. He spun in his chair, his hand instinctively going for the utility tool holstered at his hip. The cabin was empty as always. The observation port showed only the indifferent star field. He let out a slow breath. Paranoia, a common side effect of long-duration solo missions. He had read the reports. He had always scoffed at them. He forced himself to stand, stretching the stiffness from his back. He walked to the locker where the artifact lay contained. He didn't open it. He simply stood before the unadorned steel door, a strange weight settling in his chest. From the corner of his eye, he caught it again. The artifact, or rather, the impression of it, seemed to breathe. A subtle, almost imperceptible undulation of its facets, a rearrangement of its impassable angles, like a geometric shape adjusting itself in a dream. Dean snapped his gaze to the locker door, then to the precise spot on the bulkhead. Nothing. He leaned against the wall, his breath coming a little faster than before. He was tired, dangerously tired. He needed sleep. He needed to recalibrate. The discovery of the derelict, the strange artifact, it was all unsettling. He was a salvager, not an archaeologist. This was beyond his usual scope. He told himself it was the adrenaline, the sudden shift from monotonous routine to potential fortune. These fleeting distortions, these phantom sensations, they were merely the psychological fallout, nothing more. His vessel, the stray dog, thrummed faintly, a hollow vibration against the silence. He carried the artifact, still wrapped in its hastily secured tarp, through the narrow accessways of the stray dog, the faint, almost imperceptible hum radiating from it, a constant, low-frequency pulse against his palm. His destination was the ship's dedicated analysis module, a cramped, utilitarian space he had long ago designated his research station. The module was a hive of diagnostic screens, sensor arrays, and a reinforced workbench bolted to the deck plating. The air here always carried a faint tang of ozone and stale lubricant. With a grunt, he unwrapped the object, placing it carefully on the workbench's central observation plate. He reached for a data slate, intending to log its precise dimensions. As his fingers brushed the worn composite, the slate, which he just placed squarely beside the artifact, seemed to slide an inch to the left, then an inch back, without any discernible tremor in the deck. Dean blinked. He stared at his hand, then at the slate. It remained stationary. He attributed it to a micro-shift in the ship's internal gravity plating, or perhaps a slight tremor in his own hand. Fatigue, that was it. He began a more detailed visual scan, activating the research station's high-resolution optical sensors. He glanced away for a moment, adjusting a power conduit leading to the sensor arm. When his gaze returned, a heavy-duty torque wrench, which he distinctly remembered leaving in the tool rack above the workbench, now rested directly beside the artifact, its polished chrome glinting dully. He hadn't touched the wrench. He hadn't even looked at it until that moment. He picked it up, feeling its familiar heft, then returned it to its proper place, his movements deliberate. He watched it for a long minute. Nothing. His perception was playing tricks. Later, he moved from the research station to the main navigation deck, needing to check the stray dog's external sensor logs. The corridor, usually a predictable 10 paces long, felt wrong. Each step seemed to cover either too much or too little ground. The bulkhead panels, uniformly spaced, appeared to stretch and compress with each blink, as if the very fabric of the passage were breathing. It remained stubbornly in place. Yet the sensation persisted, a subtle, disorienting flux. He caught his reflection in the polished surface of a deactivated viewport. Then just as quickly, the image snapped back to his weary, familiar features. A trick of the light, he told himself, or a smudge on the glass. But the fleeting image had carried a peculiar weight, a hint of something else, something that defied the contours of human anatomy. It was like seeing a brief, impossible sketch superimposed on his own visage. Returning to the research station, a growing unease coiling in his gut, Dean activated the artifact's direct analysis protocols. He fed power to the gravimetric scanners, the electromagnetic spectrum analyzers, the chronometric resonance emitters. Data streamed across the multiple screens, filling the small space with a frantic dance of glowing symbols and pulsing graphs. He watched, determined to find a logical explanation. The initial readouts were nonsensical. Gravimetric fields registered negative mass, then impossible densities, then absolute nullity, all within the span of microseconds. Electromagnetic scans showed spectral signatures that didn't correspond to any known element or compound. Energy readings spiked and vanished, following no discernible pattern. Chronometric analysis returned temporal distortions that suggested the object existed in multiple points in time simultaneously, or perhaps no time at all. Spatial coordinates generated by the onboard mapping system looped back on themselves, creating closed geometric figures that defied Euclidean principles. One projection showed the artifact occupying a space both inside and outside the stray dog's hull at once. Dean checked the instrumentation. He ran diagnostics on every sensor, every processor, every data conduit. The research station's systems reported perfect functionality. No errors, no anomalies. His equipment was pristine, calibrated to the highest degree. His equipment was telling him impossible truths. He stared at the artifact, then at the screens. Was it the instruments, or was it him? He ran the sequence again and again, the data stubbornly, impossibly consistent in its inconsistency. As he leaned closer to a screen displaying a particularly egregious waveform, a line that somehow intersected itself without crossing a jolt ripped through his perception. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was an abrupt, alien intrusion. He saw not with his eyes, but with something deeper, a flash of immense, indifferent structures that spiraled inward upon themselves, not made of matter, but of pure, unyielding geometry. Colors pulsed, not from any spectrum he knew, but from a place beyond light. A sound, not heard but felt, reverberated through his bones, a low, resonant thrumming that spoke of ancient, cosmic indifference. He glimpsed vast, silent chasms that stretched into infinities, populated by shapes that defied description, their existence a terrifying testament to his own utter insignificance. The research station felt suddenly claustrophobic, the familiar hum of the stray dog, a flimsy shield against the encroaching vastness. He pulled back from the artifact, his chest heaving. The data screens continued their impossible dance, mocking his attempts at understanding. He had to document this. Every impossible measurement, every unsettling distortion, every fragmented vision. His vessel, the stray dog, drifted, a speck of defiance against the overwhelming emptiness. The artifact secured in the cargo hold pulsed with a silent, insistent energy that resonated in his bones, not as a vibration, but as a subtle shift in the very air he breathed, the light he saw. The protocol was clear for anomalous finds, especially those that defied known physics. Dean reached for the comms panel, his fingers hovering over the activation sequence. A research station was the nearest manned outpost, a cluster of modules orbiting a gas giant several light-years distant. He had made contact with their communications officer before, a detached voice that logged his finds and coordinated supply drops. This, however, was different. "Stray dog to research station Gamma 7, Dean articulated, his voice raspy from disuse. The console hummed, a low thrum that usually preceded a clean connection. Requesting priority channel, Dean have an unusual discovery. Static erupted, a sudden violent hiss that clawed at his ears. The comms panel flickered, the green indicator light struggling against an unseen interference. He adjusted the frequency, ran diagnostics. All systems reported nominal, yet the distortion persisted. He tried again, louder this time. Gamma 7, do you copy? This is Dean of the Stray Dog. Dean need to report an artifact. It's non-Euclidean. The last two words felt foreign on his tongue, a clumsy attempt to describe something his mind still struggled to grasp. A garbled response crackled through, a fragmented burst of sound that might have been a human voice or merely a machine struggling to interpret noise. Dean leaned closer, straining to decipher the jumble. He heard a phrase or part of one, repeat, interference. Unable to classify, frustration tightened his jaw. He knew the comms officer would be listening or at least attempting to. It's a structure, Dean continued, forcing himself to speak slowly, clearly, as if explaining to a child. It doesn't conform to three-dimensional space. The angles, they shift. It's impossible. As he spoke, the cabin around him seemed to subtly warp. The familiar metallic bulkheads of the Stray Dog rippled at the edges of his vision, their straight lines curving inward, then outward like a breath held too long. The single overhead light elongated into a teardrop, then flattened into a disk, its glow intensifying, then dimming without any discernible cause. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions remained, a persistent undercurrent to his perception. It's affecting my perception, he added, the words tasting like ash. Dean think, or, it's showing me something about the way things are. The comms officer's voice, when it finally broke through, was clearer, but laced with a professional detachment that bordered on suspicion. Dean, your signal is heavily corrupted. We're detecting unusual energy signatures from your position. Can you confirm your vessel's integrity? Are you experiencing sensory deprivation psychosis? Sensory deprivation psychosis. The clinical term hung in the air, cold and dismissive. Dean knew what it implied, a mind unraveling under the pressure of isolation. But this was not isolation. This was revelation. It wasn't a hallucination in the traditional sense, but an overlay, a transparency on the existing reality. Colossal, in different forms, drifted through the cosmic fabric, not in space, but as space. They were not creatures with limbs or eyes, but configurations of pure alien mathematics. Their scale so immense that stars were mere motes of dust caught in their unseen currents. Its presence was not hostile, but utterly, terrifyingly, unaware of anything as small as Dean or his vessel or even his entire star system. He looked at the artifact, still secured in the hold, and then back at the warped reality of his cabin. The connection solidified. The artifact was not a source of infection, not a device broadcasting illusions. It was a lens, a filter removed, a veil lifted. It was showing him the true, underlying structure of existence, a reality far vaster and more terrifyingly indifferent than humanity had ever conceived. Dean, respond immediately. Your readings are spiking. Are you in distress? The comms officer's voice was now tinged with urgency, but it felt distant, irrelevant. He opened his mouth, but the words caught. How could he describe the geometry of non-existence, the entities of pure concept, the indifferent immensity that swallowed all meaning? His language, human language, was built for a three-dimensional world, for comprehensible cause and effect. It had no vocabulary for this. He closed his mouth. The comms officer continued to call, but Dean merely stared at the flickering panel, then at the shifting lines of his cabin. The stray dog was a tiny, fragile shell, adrift not just in physical space, but in a reality that had suddenly revealed itself to be monstrously, beautifully, utterly alien. And he was the only one who could see it. The clinical term, sensory deprivation psychosis, echoed with a hollow finality. Dean had heard it before, a convenient label for inconvenient minds, but the vision blooming behind his eyes was no hallucination born of isolation. It was an unwelcome clarity, a brutal truth superimposed over the familiar, sterile surfaces of the research station. He stood in what had been the primary observation deck, a panoramic viewport that once offered a simulated view of distant nebulae. Now, the view was a churning canvas of impossible geometries. Colors shifted, not like a spectrum, but like dimensions folding in on themselves, revealing hues that violated optical recognition. The room itself began to undulate. The deck plating, a dull gray alloy, rippled like a disturbed pond. What had been a solid bulkhead to his left now seemed to stretch and thin, its surface shimmering with an internal luminescence, revealing faint, skeletal structures beneath. He reached out, his hand passing through the shimmering material as if it were a dense gas. A cold, metallic scent, like ozone mixed with something utterly alien, filled his nostrils. He pulled his hand back, a prickle of revulsion crawling up his arm. He needed to move to find a stable point. He remembered the main corridor, a long, straight path leading to the docking bay. He turned, his boots scuffing on the now pliable floor. The corridor was there, but it wasn't. Its length stretched into an infinite vanishing point, the perspective skewed, as if viewed through a broken lens. Yet their presence was undeniable, a constant, unsettling hum beneath the cacophony of his unraveling reality. He started walking, each step a conscious effort against the perceived drag of the warping floor. The walls, once a solid barrier, now seemed porous, breathing in and out. He could hear faint, grinding sounds, like tectonic plates shifting on a miniature scale, emanating from within the very structure of the station. He pressed a hand against a wall, feeling a subtle vibration, a resonant frequency that seemed to bypass his skin and vibrate directly against his bones. His mind, once a fortress of logical deduction, now grappled with a new, terrifying framework. The artifact, a relic of impossible design, rested in a containment field in the central laboratory. He remembered its non-Euclidean angles, its surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He had dismissed its influence as a psychological trick, a product of his isolation and the stress of the salvage mission. Now he understood. The artifact wasn't merely an object. It was a conduit, a lens. It wasn't distorting his reality. It was revealing the true one. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The impossible shapes, the shifting colors, the entities lurking in the periphery, these were not hallucinations. They were the raw, unfiltered truth of existence, laid bare by the artifact's alien geometry. The universe wasn't the neat, predictable cosmos depicted in the star charts or the comforting, human-centric narratives of exploration. It was this chaotic, indifferent maelstrom of non-Euclidean forms and unfathomable energies. He could feel the station itself, or what he perceived as the station, groaning and protesting against the revelation. He wasn't just seeing the universe differently, he was experiencing it. The entities in his periphery, those indistinct, shifting forms, were not malevolent. They simply were. They moved through their own incomprehensible existence, utterly oblivious to Dean's or any human's suffering or joy. His failures, his haunted past, the very concept of his individual identity, they were rendered meaningless against this backdrop. The universe did not care. It simply was, in all its monstrous, beautiful, indifferent complexity. They were not coming for him. They were simply passing through, their true forms momentarily intersecting with his limited perception. Dean understood now. He was not going mad. He was merely seeing, and the vision was a torment far more exquisite than any madness. It was an unwelcome clarity, a brutal truth superimposed over the familiar contours of the small utilitarian chamber within the research station. The artifact, a knot of impossible angles and surfaces that defied solid form, pulsed with a silent, internal light. It sat on the reinforced plinth, serene and malevolent. At the heart of the observation bay, a cold certainty settled over him, displacing the frantic doubt. This was not his mind breaking, it was his mind seeing, and what it saw demanded a response. Dean's jaw tightened. He would not be a passive observer to his own dissolution. He would fight. His gaze swept the research station's interior. Tools, salvaged from countless derelict vessels, lay scattered on a nearby workbench. Plasma cutters, hydraulic wrenches, heavy-duty demolition charges, crude, effective instruments designed to dismantle metal and rock. He picked up a titanium pry bar, its weight familiar and reassuring in his grip, a tangible anchor in the shifting landscape of his perception. Enough, he rasped, the word tasting like ash. His voice, usually a low rumble, was sharp, edged with a desperation he rarely allowed himself. He approached the plinth, each step deliberate, a defiant rhythm against the subtle hum that now seemed to emanate from every surface. It was a physical object, and physical objects could be destroyed, or failing that, removed. He brought the pry bar down with a grunt, aiming for what he perceived as a seam where the artifact met the plinth. The impact was jarring, a dull thud that vibrated up his arms, but the artifact remained unmarked. No dent, no scratch, no tremor. Dean tried again, harder, putting his full weight into the swing. The pry bar glanced off, the force of the rebound almost wrenching it from his grasp. Frustration surged, hot and bitter. He tossed the pry bar aside, its metallic clang echoing in the confined space. Next, the plasma cutter. Its hum was a welcome, mechanical counterpoint to the artifact's silent thrum. He ignited the beam, a focused lance of white-hot energy, and directed it at the artifact's surface. The beam simply spread, diffusing over the impossible angles, creating no heat, no scorch mark, no incision. It was like trying to cut water with light. The tool's safety systems registered no resistance, no material to vaporize. It simply passed over. Dean stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just resilient. This was impossible. He considered jettisoning it. The research station had an emergency airlock, designed for waste disposal or critical system failures. A desperate final measure. He moved to the control panel, his fingers flying over the holographic interface. He selected the airlock sequence, initiated the cargo bay transfer. Error messages flickered across the display, mass anomaly detected, material composition unknown, but the interface itself seemed to resist. The schematics of the research station on the display began to subtly warp. It wasn't that the artifact was indestructible. It was that the rules of destruction, the very laws governing matter and energy, simply did not apply to it. Or more terrifyingly, they no longer applied to anything in its immediate vicinity, including Dean himself. The artifact was not merely an object. It was a lens, a filter through which reality was being re-rendered. He looked at his hands. They were solid, familiar, yet the spaces between his fingers seemed to stretch and contract with each breath. the comforting, ordered reality he had always known. The one humanity had constructed with its neat categories and predictable physics was a fragile, self-imposed lie. The artifact wasn't evil in the way a malevolent entity was evil. It was simply true, and the truth was monstrous, not because it sought to harm, but because it simply was, indifferent to human perception, human sanity, human existence. The horror was the fundamental nature of existence itself, laid bare. It was the universe as it truly was, vast, indifferent, and utterly alien to any comforting human construct. And Dean, through the artifact, was now seeing it. He was not going mad. He was simply irrevocably understanding. The artifact was not separate from him anymore. Its truth had seeped into the very fibers of his being, twisting his perception, irrevocably altering the lens through which he viewed everything. There was no going back. The schematics of the research station pulsed on the display, a fractured mosaic of impossibility. Dean's fingers hovered over the console, his breath shallow. He tried to override, to manually input parameters, to force the system into compliance. Each press of a button, however, yielded not a command, but a further visual distortion. The input panel itself began to ripple, the metallic surface appearing to breathe, its edges blurring into an indistinct haze. He slammed his palm against the console, a jolt of frustration and fear electrifying his arm. The impact resonated, not just through the metal, but through his very bones. A strange vibration began to thrum beneath his skin, emanating from his core, spreading outwards. It felt like his internal organs were humming in a discordant chorus. His vision flickered, the sterile white walls of the research station momentarily dissolving into a swirling vortex of impossible colors, hues that existed outside the known spectrum, burning with a silent intensity. Dean stumbled back, gripping the edge of a nearby equipment rack. The metal felt slick, yet dry, as if its surface was subtly shifting under his touch. His reflection in a polished panel stared back at him, but it was not quite right. He blinked, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his haggard features. Yet the memory of it lingered, a cold shard in his mind. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the central chamber where the artifact rested. It was not a sound perceived by the ears, but a vibration felt in the deepest recesses of his skull, a pressure building behind his eyes. The floor beneath his boots seemed to undulate, a slow, deliberate wave. He fought against a sudden, overwhelming urge to fall to his knees, to press his face against the shifting deck plating and submit. This was not a physical force. It was a psychological imperative, a profound recognition of a superior order. He forced himself to look at his hands. They appeared normal, yet a persistent phantom sensation of elongation, of an extra joint, made him clench and unclench his fists. The world was no longer simply warping around him, it was warping within him. The artifact was not just a lens. It was a catalyst, rebuilding his very internal architecture to accommodate the truths it projected. The research station, which had once felt like a solid, albeit isolated structure, now seemed utterly transparent. He saw the faint, shimmering strands of energy that bound stellar nurseries, the slow, agonizing ballet of galaxies colliding, not as distant spectacles, but as immediate, tangible processes occurring just beyond the thin hull. He saw the raw, unthinking mechanics of creation and destruction, a relentless engine without purpose or design. His breath hitched. He wasn't seeing through the station, he was seeing through reality itself. The artifact had peeled back the layers of human perception, revealing the raw, unadorned truth. The universe was not a grand design, nor a malevolent entity. It was a vast, indifferent mechanism, operating on principles utterly alien to human comprehension. Its scale was so immense, its processes so unfathomable, that concepts of good or evil, purpose or meaning were rendered utterly irrelevant. The realization struck him with the force of a collapsing star. His own life, his failures, his triumphs, his very existence were utterly meaningless. It was not the despair of personal loss, but the despair of ultimate insignificance. His sanity, a fragile construct built on comforting illusions, shattered like glass. A tremor ran through his body, not of fear but of absolute terrifying clarity. His physical form felt simultaneously impossibly vast and infinitesimally small. He could feel the flow of every atom within him, and at the same time, the crushing weight of everything outside him. He was a micro-universe, briefly aware of a macro-universe that did not care. The transformation was complete, not of flesh, but of perception. He was no longer Dean, the salvager. He was a conduit, a lens, a fleeting moment of self-awareness in an infinite, uncaring sprawl. Dean's fingers hovered over the console, the fractured schematics of the research station, a digital testament to impossible geometry. He could try to bypass it, force his way in, but the ship's systems screamed warnings about structural integrity, about protocols that simply did not exist. He had to let the station's impossible logic integrate with his own systems, with his own perception. A shudder ran through the deck plates as he initiated the sequence. The research station loomed, a vast, silent monolith of rust and unknown alloys, its surfaces rippling in his peripheral vision even before the direct link was established. The interface flickered, then solidified into something alien. Data streams, once orderly columns of information, now flowed in recursive loops, twisting back on themselves, forming patterns that suggested meaning without ever quite delivering it. He guided his ship into the docking bay. The bay itself was a cavernous space, yet somehow smaller than it should have been. Angles shifted as he watched, walls seeming to breathe, to expand and contract with an organic rhythm that defied all physics. He disembarked, the ship's internal lights casting long, unsteady shadows. Footsteps echoed, not just his own, but others, spectral and out of sync, from directions that made no sense. He found what appeared to be the central research chamber. In the center, a pedestal, empty, but the air above it shimmered, an invisible presence radiating a profound, silent hum that vibrated in his teeth. This was it, the source, or perhaps the lens. He reached out, his hand passing through the shimmering air. There was no physical object, no solid form, yet the moment his fingers breached the invisible barrier, the world exploded, not with sound or light, but with understanding. It wasn't a vision, not a hallucination. It was a download, a direct feed into the deepest parts of his mind. He saw humanity, not as a pinnacle of creation, but as a fleeting pattern in the foam, a momentary flicker of self-awareness on a tiny speck, utterly insignificant, utterly alone. The grand narratives, the search for meaning, the struggles for survival, all of it was a fragile, self-constructed illusion. A desperate attempt to impose order on a universe that cared nothing for order, nothing for life, nothing for him. There was no malevolent force, no grand design, just an infinite, uncaring sprawl. His perception fractured entirely. He was a ripple in a puddle, seeing the true, boundless ocean. Dean's ship drifted, a derelict ghost in the forgotten quadrant. Its external lights were dead, its hull scarred by micrometeorites and the passage of time. Weeks later, a lone salvager, drawn by a faint, anomalous energy signature, approached. The salvager, a grizzled veteran with a keen eye for valuable debris, hailed the ship. No response. He docked carefully, his own vessel's sensors picking up faint, erratic power fluctuations within the derelict. The salvager moved through the silent corridors, his heavy boots echoing. On the main display, a single frozen image, the schematics of a research station rendered in impassable, shifting geometry. He frowned, a prickle of unease running up his spine. The lines on the screen seemed to subtly undulate, to stretch and contract as he watched, just at the edge of his vision. He blinked, shaking his head. Trick of the light, or maybe just tired. He found Dean's log. The final entry was garbled, fragmented, mostly static. But a few words cut through the noise, delivered in a voice that was no longer quite human, but resonating with a profound, terrifying calm. Not evil, it just is, the truth. Waiting, he looked around the cockpit again. For a fleeting instant, the bulkhead seemed to curve inward, the ceiling to stretch impossibly high before snapping back to normal. He rubbed his eyes, dismissed it. He had a job to do. There was salvage here. And a strange, quiet hum seemed to emanate from the derelict's core, a vibration so subtle it could have been his imagination or the distant thrum of his own ship. It was a hum that promised understanding, a truth just out of reach, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to glimpse it.